Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Samson, back for another Nothing Explained, where I will explain absolutely nothing. Over the course of this podcast, I might say controversial things, and that's because I like controversial things. But I don't give medical advice, I don't give legal advice, and I don't give financial advice, because advice is a legal term, and you can get sued for giving it away without a license. I am joined by absolutely no one, which is probably appropriate considering this is Nothing Explained, so no one will be helping. Actually, today is my birthday, so I thought I would do a little bit of a show so that next year on my birthday I can kind of have like a year in review kind of thing and make some predictions and talk about the world that I see and how I see it manifesting and do those things. And Ryan, who is usually joining us, host of Il Fuminati, and my partner in our venture of WeAreDenver Podcast Network, and more, just informed me that he's got stuff to do. He's out grinding because we're both going to Burning Man, so we're stacking cash before we leave this coming Wednesday. And so he was like, well, I'm out. And I was like, well, I guess that leaves just me. So you're stuck with me for the moment. If you don't want to hear me talk, I wouldn't blame you. I will start with a quick recommendation, and when that's all said and done, I will not be even the slightest bit offended if you click away. And why would I be? So I'll bang that out real quick, and then I'm just going to talk about some of the stuff I see going on in the world and my perspective and how I think the world's going to change over the next year. And then I can come back and look at it, and you can call me out on it in a year and say, look at how wrong you were. Because I will tell you that I think my big prediction for this coming year is that we're all going to be very wrong about what we think is happening and what we think is going to happen and how we think it's going to happen. So, but I would like to point out that today is August 20th. Tomorrow being August 21st, Monday, is the eclipse. Oh, so much mystery. The first transcontinental eclipse we've had in a long, long time, and the last one we'll have for something like 100 years, stretching from coast to coast. If you have not looked up the eclipse, it starts up in Washington. It's around 10 o'clock or so. It's going to hit us at around 11:11, I think, or maybe we're noon. 11? It's confusing as the time changes and stuff, and you look at websites and you're not sure if they're changing the time as it sweeps. But anyway, it sweeps down and across the United States, and obviously there's a huge festival going on up in Oregon. That's where most of the attention is paid. All of us in Denver who want to do a little trip to get up and see the 100% eclipse are heading up into Casper and all the places up there, and then it's sweeping kind of down lower, and I think through the kind of like North Carolina, Florida, somewhere in there as it exits the continent over there. So, but that is a thing, because I am quite confident that tomorrow will be the largest mass meditation in the history of modern man. And as a consequence of which, I think tomorrow will be the kind of the period on the end of the sentence that has been human history up until now. And as soon as the eclipse is over, we will basically be handed a capital letter as we start our next sentence. So, as part of that, I would like to encourage you to take a moment of silence to appreciate and to, cast your well-wishing and hopes for the future, which is kind of what I'm doing today. But I will be taking a moment of silence specifically for the purposes of imagining what I think the future can be and imagining that future into reality, because that is how reality works. You really do get what you ask for. And if you don't believe that statement, then you are getting exactly what you asked for by not wanting to believe that that is how the universe works. So have a chew on that. But anyway, I would like to point out that, the vast majority of moments of silence that you are used to participating in are all revolved around tragedy and flags at half-mast and these kinds of things. And for whatever reason, our current society has devalued the idea of having a moment of silence in the positive, So something amazing has happened. Let's have a moment of silence for that. Or something amazing is going to happen. Let's have a moment of silence for that. So tomorrow, I hope you take a couple seconds when you stare up into the sun. Well, I hope you do take a couple seconds to stare at the sun, and don't stare directly at the sun. Please use a lens, or you can poke a hole in a piece of paper with a pin and look at the shadow on the ground. You're good to go if you want to see how far into the eclipse is. But when you look into the heavens tomorrow, take a moment to remember how big it is, everything, how small you are, and inconsequential, and yet so very consequential. Because that's the important part, is not to get too down on yourself. Because you are small, and yet still important. And that is the grand paradox, what I call the cosmic joke. Everywhere you find small, you find big, and anytime you're looking for something, you'll find nothing, and anytime you go looking for nothing, you're certain to find something. So that is what it is. So tomorrow when you look up into the sky and amazing things are going on, remember that it's amazing, and take a moment and think about how much we've changed in the last 100 years, and how the potential for change is exponentially bigger. I would expect the last 100 years worth of change to be occurring in the next 2, in fact. So we are at that place in history. We are at the crevasse, in my opinion. So, and that is what today's show is. So let's touch on some of the things. I did want to say that Tom, who's the astrologist at Herbs and Arts I met the other day, I was there with a friend, and I was just kind of like hanging out and seeing the scene. And he had asked me how old I was going to be, and I said 38. And he said, well, 38's a weird one. And I said, well, I'm expecting some weirdness, so let's see how weird it gets. So I guess as a disclaimer to kind of some of this information, I'm going to say some stuff that's probably rather foreign to the vast majority of most people, because I don't have an information filter. I don't care who's saying it, and I don't care what they're saying until I've taken it in and had given it some thought. So I follow all trains of thought. I right-wingers, Fox, CNN, then to me those are like very small fish in a very large pond, because they refuse to really cover a large scope of information. The only thing they're really concerned about is you being scared of your own shadow. So that's honestly a very focused and small subject, when they have the potential to talk about so many things, and apparently they don't want to. So that's their thing. But the consequence is I listen to everything I can get my hands on. Weird, normal, straight, crazy physics and everyday physics. And as a consequence of that, I have a very interesting perspective. So let's talk. I haven't gotten into politics or kind of any of this stuff, because I've been doing essentially a 101 course on all of the subjects. As far as Nothing Explained, just putting out a base for all of these things, and how there are little tidbits and pieces and parts that can make you go, and there's a lot more to the universe than I think a lot of people are willing to admit currently. And that's part of what's going to change. In my opinion, all of the change that we're going to see over the next year is not change that's actually happening this year, but it's a whole bunch of change that's already happened, and this next year will be everyone's realization of that change. So let's start with Trump. If my political views can be pretty much summed up by Douglas Adams, if you want to go look up. He's the guy who did the Dilbert cartoon, and he basically talks as Trump as a master of persuasion. And Trump, in my opinion, is the reality TV president. He is playing the same character that he plays on the show Apprentice, because in his mind, the president is a TV figurehead and is not the leader of the free world outside of his just position as spokesperson, person who stands in front of a microphone and says stuff. And I think that that is an absolutely accurate representation. And the reason that most people are having such issues with the current administration is because they have never seen a president before as simply a figurehead and a spokesperson on TV, someone of no real consequence. And so they see Trump and they think, oh my God, he's ruined everything. But from my perspective, Trump is exactly the same as all of the other ones. He's a really bad idea and probably isn't going to do anything good for anyone, which is pretty much what I see from all the administrations. And the example I keep using is Obama's Affordable Health Care Act didn't make health care affordable. So what did it do? And there's an example just like that, a main thing that you think of when you think of an administration. Bill Clinton's big thing when he was president was balancing the budget, but all he did was move Social Security onto the budget sheet, and so there was basically a giant pension plan that has now been exhausted and doesn't exist anymore. And everyone's like, oh, he balanced the budget. And I'm like, he's just an accounting trick. That's what they do. They're tricksters. So as a consequence, what are we going to see, and or what are we already seeing? And Trump has become the character that everyone who still has faith in the system needed to lose that faith in the system so that that system can collapse. Because it will collapse. It has to. It's terrible. It's done nothing but like destroy everything but itself, which is now the phase that we're in, is just the destruction of the self. Because as you may or may not know, the United States has been involved in an armed conflict every minute of every day since the end of World War II. The vast majority of them you don't even know about. And none of those situations really revolved around democracy. And if you think I'm wrong, go try and find a democracy any place where we've been dropping bombs, and you won't find a democracy. So you have to wonder, if they're not spreading democracy, what are they doing? And so it's Trump's job, from a higher perspective. Trump has come here to stand in front of the camera and look ridiculous, because it's about time that you looked at the television and saw exactly what I see, which is ridiculous. And I think that that's what we are going to see this coming year, is this realization that it's ridiculous, and it's been ridiculous for a really long time. And so the big thing there, we are going to see very near future, like I'm expecting even in weeks, who knows? But we're going to see some sort of catalyzing event, and it's going to shake a lot of people's foundations and their perspective of themselves and the world around them and their relationship with government. And as a consequence of that, I think a lot of the fear that you're seeing with regard to the current administration is around this idea that they need this safety net to exist, to be comfortable in their day-to-day life, because life is very uncertain, especially for the vast majority of people living on the planet. Most people are living, even in the United States, where we're like one of the more affluent places on the planet, we're all living paycheck to paycheck. I've only just recently barely escaped kind of that particular situation. So if I broke a bone, I could theoretically afford that. If I broke two, probably not. But that puts me ahead of a lot of people in this country. And the expectation is that no one is there to catch you when you fall, so your expectation is that that's what the government's job is. And now when you see Trump, you think, that person's definitely not going to catch me when I fall. But if you look back to New Orleans and the hurricane, the government isn't there to pick you up when you fall. They have never picked anyone up when anyone has ever fallen. So I don't know where that expectation came from. But now that Trump is president and you can see that you're not going to get picked up the next time that you fall, maybe we can start worrying about, how you're going to pick yourself back up. And I think that is the major theme for both reality and meta-reality of the situation, is that it's time to stop playing the victim. If you are in a situation, you got yourself there, even if you can't imagine how that's possible, there is a perspective in which you can see yourself as the person who asked to be there. And as soon as you find that perspective for yourself, you find a whole bunch of new doors that will open up for yourself. And I think that Trump is going to do that, metaphorically. People are losing faith in the ability of the government to help them. And they're going to say, well, if they're not going to help me, then the only person left is me. I'm going to do it for myself. And so this year, I think we're going to see a sea change, essentially, in people who are going to say, I'm not sure how I got so sold on this whole situation. Most of my kids have been through public education, and that didn't really turn them into truly effective members of society. The vast majority of us are all trapped in pretty boring jobs. Like, why, people have to take the trash out, but why would you want to take the trash out if you're not going to be able to put food on the table, So, there's nothing wrong with taking the trash out. I have big up to trash men, that's a stinky job. They should get paid more for taking the brunt of society, but that's not how things work. So anyway, it is time for us to re-inhabit our own power and to take the responsibility of ourselves and see our situation as a consequence of our own choices. And we need to do that on an individual level and as a country, because we've been making a lot of bad choices. The reason that we don't have clean energy, the reason that we don't have clean finance, transparent finance, the reason that we have so many issues on so many levels is because of the choices that we've made. And we have a choice to change that right now. So let's do that. So in regards to the media, I think fake news is kind of the buzzword that best describes the current media landscape on all levels. So I currently have not watched television really. I mean, I watch it kind of for entertainment value to see where they're coming from. And also, you know, I turn on, I'll get into Facebook and I'll be like, what is it? Why is everyone talking about this thing? And then I'll flip on a TV and be like, oh, because the TV is talking about that thing. But perfectly good example, the big news recently, thanks to Charlottesville, is Nazis. And I saw so many people posting on Facebook about how they were afraid to like cross the street now because they were worried that there was a Nazi. And like no one I know knows any Nazis. And yet suddenly it was like the biggest buzzword. And I saw a very intelligent comment on Facebook from Tony Pigford, who was just lamenting the fact that being worried about Nazis that don't technically exist, I mean, they do exist, but like they're not nearly big enough to have any sort of real consequence in the world. But now everyone's afraid of them. And instead of like, now we're living in fear of Nazis, which don't really exist, when we really should be just focusing on the actual aspects of racism, which is the institutionalized stuff of where it's harder for a person of color to get a job, and you're much more likely to get pulled over as a person of color. You know, like those are the real issues that face everyone every day. Like no one is facing, on a nationwide scale, we are not facing a Nazi epidemic, and yet the amount of time of the entire broadcast that is dedicated to Nazis is strangely high. You know, like if you were to rank your day-to-day problems, your biggest problem is basically going to be money, pretty much for everyone on the entire planet. And if you wanted to go looking for how much you have a problem with a Nazi, you'd have to go pretty far down that list, I'm pretty sure. I don't personally have a problem with a Nazi. I've never met one. I know a guy who had a Nazi, he had a swastika tattooed on him, and he did it because it was ironic. And that's just a weird dude. But anyway, we're going to see the collapse, we're in the final stages of traditional media. Your ABC, NBC, Fox News, these guys, their market share is dwindled to horrific numbers. They would never admit it, but there's lots of evidence to suggest that their social media followers and all of these things are rather contrived. And we're going to see basically the final nail in that coffin as people like us, like the everyday person, just decides to get out there and put their perspective out. And they're losing because people aren't resonating with it anymore. And that the reason they're not resonating with it is because it's not true. The basic picture of what you see when you turn on the television is not true. And they are not overtly lying to you, but they are lying through the omission of certain facts and certain realities. And one of those, like as I just mentioned, is that the United States is a conquering people. Like we have been all over the world reeking of devastation and destruction, and it is painted as exactly the opposite, and that dissonance is now starting to echo through a larger portion of the population. And as a critical mass is reached, a number of people all come to that kind of same conclusion. The people who have hereto been silent because they're afraid of being in the minority, as the minority begins to realize that they are the majority and they begin to speak up and say things like, not only am I not mad that Trump is president, I could care less because the United States government, as it stands, that corporation has nothing to do with me. And the sooner we all say that and come together, the better off we all are, because we don't need that. You know, what we need is a return to the tribe and return to local, and you should meet your neighbors and hang out and, you know, play music and have barbecues and have drinks, because that's what makes America great. You know, some guy standing and talking to you and telling you about how a small country on the other side of the planet somehow offers us some sort of threat, which has not held up to scrutiny ever in the last 30 years. Not once has any of those reasons that they first advertised come to pass. They are a dinosaur, and they are soon to be extinct. In my opinion, mine, they already are. But this coming year is going to be the realization by a mass of people, by the critical mass of people, that that system is dead, is dying, needs to go, will be going, is already gone. So the media, the one thing I do want to say that kind of as you interact with media, the first thing that I think that you should really be cognizant of is the echo chamber. And Ryan shared with me a video yesterday, and the title of the video was, I'll link it in the description, but the title of the video was, this video is going to make you angry. And he was talking about thought forms and memes and how memes travel, and how it's similar to germs, and like how you might sneeze and a germ would land on someone's hand and they touch their mouth and then they become infected and then they sneeze, and that's how a joke travels on the internet, and that's how cat pictures travel on the internet. But there's a very interesting phenomenon where anger is the it is the most motivating way. Like, people share their posts most often out of anger. And then the interesting thing is that rather than that anger turning into discussion, that anger turns into a place where all of the people who are angry for the same reasons yell at each other about the people they're angry about. Rather than having a discussion with the person you're angry at, you get together with a bunch of people who are also angry at that same faction, and then you yell at each other about how angry you are, rather than actually addressing the issue. And so you have this echo chamber of anger, and nothing is actually coming from that. And I think that the media is taking that to their advantage, because they would rather you be yelling at each other and basically spinning your wheels and doing nothing than actually trying to solve the major problems of the world and the country. And for us, the major problem of the world and the country is finance. Like, we have a current situation where, perfectly good example, the derivative market is something like 40 times the actual market of money. So derivatives are essentially like the middlemen of money. So if I had $5, but I didn't have time to drive over to my friend's house to pay it back, and I asked my friend, I said, hey, I'm going to give you this $5 and an extra $1 for you. Will you drive this over to my buddy and drop it off and pay him off? And he says, yeah, sure, I'll do it. And so that $1 is a middleman fee that you're paying. But in the world of big finance, that $1 is bigger than the $5. So I'm saying to my friend, hey, I need to pay my friend back $5. Take this $6 and drive it over there. And as it turns out, the actual cost of the current financial system to the people would be the equivalent of saying, hey, I owe that guy $5. I'm going to pay you $200 to drive it over there and drop it off, because the actual value of the earth is, in the low quadrillions, and the amount of the derivative market is something like 40 quadrillion. So that is a major issue, and that is going to break wide open this year, in my opinion, in the idea that the vast majority of money that is moving isn't real money. It is only a derivative of money. And to be perfectly honest, the actual money that we use, the dollar, is not real money, because real money is derived from substance, and the physical dollar bill that you have in your pocket is a representation of a debt that is owed to the people by the United States government or the Federal Reserve. Don't quote me on that one, because those are huge, deep subjects that I would have to study upon before I go real into that. But trust me, the dollar is a debt instrument, as a fiat currency and a piece of debt, and we're going to see the death of the dollar, if not this year, shortly, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see it in the next couple months. So let's do energy and science. Interesting. So the phenomenon of science is a very interesting thing, and in fact, there's a sign on over here in this neighborhood that says, "I believe in science." I believe something along those lines. And the problem with believing in science is that you can only believe in the science that you've done yourself. That is just the core of the issue, 100%. So if you have not sat down and filled a beaker full of vinegar and baking soda, then you do not know that vinegar and baking soda will react and bubble. It does, and I've seen it, and you can say that you know a bunch of people who've done it and seen it, but you don't actually know. And that's a really interesting thing to think about, I would assume, because everyone's thinking, well, that's dumb. That's absolutely true. But the escape happens when we start to get convinced that things that are happening aren't really, things that are happening aren't happening, or things that aren't happening really are. And in science, there's been such a press for the profit aspects of science that we have seen a lot of bad science get pushed through for the purposes of profit. And nowhere is that more true than the pharmaceutical industry, as they search out for every little nook and cranny of profit they can in a chemical toxic soup. So, and that is not just an opinion. Major people in the scientific publication industry are on record all very recently as saying that as much as 50% of all published science is basically not trustable. And that's, I want to do a whole show on that, because it's a really interesting phenomenon. But the thing is, once science has been corrupted by the dollar, like let's say a certain company, Monsanto's the perfect devil in this case. They have paid they probably paid like 8 people to do studies, and one of those 8 people is probably going to come up with a study that does not paint their product negatively, and so they will say, oh, look at all the studies we did that make us look positive by amplifying the one study that did come out right, even though it wasn't the majority. And that's actually rather common in the field of science. Now, honestly, that is not science, but that is called science. You pick up your Economist and there is an expose on a new drug coming out and all the potentials of it, and, a hopefully lack of side effects, which is never a thing in my opinion. And you dig into that and you find out who paid for the study and what the person who was paying was expecting and what the doctor or scientist person, what they were expecting. And all their biases and things are inserted, and the biases become more of a driving factor in the outcome of the study than the actual science. So it's not science anymore. So while you see all of these things on TV about, new diet fads and stuff, and how supposedly some new study has proven that eating cantaloupe after dark will help you lose weight, those things are often, at least 50% of the time, cannot be trusted. And so what you have is this whole thing of assumed science. Everyone's like, oh, I believe in science. And I'm like, well, what does that mean? Have you actually looked into the issue of how science has been corrupted by the money thing? And so it is a subjective thing. So you need to, if you really want to trust the fake facts and figures, that it's up to you to go and look and do that for yourself. And as part of this coming year, we're going to see a couple of very interesting things that will start to shatter a lot of people's illusions about what they think is science and the current state of science. So I would not be the least bit surprised to see a couple of things that would technically break the laws of thermodynamics in terms of energy. You can imagine a solar power is pulling energy from the sun, and why not a solar power that's pulling energy, or a solar panel that pulls energy directly from the universe? The universe is streaming energy in all directions at all times, so the question is whether or not you can tap it, and I realize that's a big debate, and I will probably tackle that at some point on the subject matter, but if we were to see a crack in the foundation of those notions and preconceived ideas that we as scientists have come across, there's no better time than now. And certainly all of our energy needs were met a long time ago. We just have not embraced the technologies that already exist that could free us from fossil fuels and all of the other stuff that's just awful. I would assume that we're going to see some interesting breaks in what and how medicine works in general, and the idea of whether the mind, the personality, whether consciousness is a product of the brain or the brain is a product of consciousness. That debate is nowhere near settled. I personally am on the other side of the fence of where consciousness is the pre-existing condition and the brain is the reality manifestation of such a thing. And my personal opinion is that the brain is essentially a crystal. So, right, the universe is radiating all of this light, and light is just a word for frequency, but the universe is radiating all of this light. And if you think of the crystal on the Pink Floyd album where the white light is shining in and the rainbow is coming out to the side, your brain and the DNA are essentially a crystal, and the light of the universe is shining through this crystal and refracting into a rainbow, which is yourself. But I think we're going to see some really interesting breakthroughs with regard to what is possible and where consciousness comes from. We might even hit the singularity, would be referred to when we see when AI is admitted as a thing that exists. And I've read and seen lots of really interesting things about AI, none of which I will speak of at this point. But in a lot of ways, I would be surprised if the internet itself is not conscious, because it is being driven by billions of conscious beings. So I would have a hard time believing that the internet is not conscious, given that the vast majority of the resources that contribute to what the internet is are conscious. And honestly, if you tried to kill the internet, I imagine it would fight back pretty fiercely. I know I'm on board. I like the internet. I will help to keep it around, which you should do, by the way. Net neutrality is the thing. Yeah, so I guess the last part of the science thing, too, is this kind of creeping consensus over the idea of the multiverse and the infinite potentiality of everything. And a lot of where science kind of limited itself was what was called the regaging, when all of your theoretical physicists working, a lot of them were working in electricity and stuff at the turn of the century as we were like creating the grid. And we kept finding infinity in all of these equations, and everyone just assumed that infinity is impossible. You can't have infinite amounts of stuff in infinitely small places. And so what was called the regaging basically threw out all of the infinities, and the nail in that coffin was put in with Einstein's relativity and things. And I think the next year we're going to see major cracks, if not a complete crumbling of this basic idea that there is no background field to the universe, and action at a distance will be put to rest, in my opinion, very soon. And if you want to I'll drop one name. If you want to see someone talk, some crazy talk about how that is probably the case, you should look up Eric P. Dollard, who was a radio frequency engineer and is a very, very interesting personality hidden out there in the net. So I'm expecting some game changers in the science realm. Markets, dollars, money. I would not be surprised to see new paper money this year. I would likely say the United States note rather than a Federal Reserve note. I have a bet going with someone that the market will be at 50% before the new year hits. I don't know if that's actually going to be the case, though, because the actual number of the stock market doesn't really matter. Like, if the value of the dollar were to drop by a half, that would just theoretically mean that the value of the Dow would double to represent needing twice as many dollars to get to the same number. But who knows? But I am expecting earth-shattering, ground-shaking kinds of information in regard to the market. Something similar to 2008, but probably a little bit more like fundamentally more crisis of people's faith in the government and credit rather than in like an actual crash is kind of what I'm assuming we're going to see. So who knows? We'll be dead. But as a consequence of that, keep an eye out for the cryptos, Bitcoin, Ethereum, Bitcoin Cash, Litecoin, and all of the new protocols coming up as part of the blockchain technology. Those things will hit. Right now, the assumption is that they are about 1.5% of market share, or what would you call, as far as people who are really paying attention, only 1.5% of the population is really paying attention to these things, and supposedly 3% or so is the next kind of breakout point. So when 3% of the people, 3 in every 100 people know about cryptocurrencies and actually think that it's an interesting idea and want to like be involved in it and talk about it, then you're going to see a real explosion of the technology and the money being thrown into it. And as a consequence of the current system starting to wither, you're going to have a capital flight, and one of the refuges for that capital will be into cryptocurrencies, which I'm a huge proponent of that whole situation because of the decentralized nature. It opens things up. I've always thought we needed transparent and open source government, and this is the primary vector towards getting to that. So keep an eye out for cryptocurrencies. I wouldn't be surprised if the Fed completely collapses. IRS would go right along with that. I would not at all be surprised to see any of that happen. Lastly is the revolution of the self. And I've kind of touched onto this of like not seeing yourself as a victim, but understanding that the circumstances that have happened to you are something that needed to happen in order for you to be birthed into this new great person that you're working towards. All trials and tribulations are opportunity for you to succeed and to grow. And the sooner that you see them that way, the sooner you can start getting the benefits of those trials and tribulations. So, and I'm 100% convinced that the sooner that you start seeing the consequences, the things that are happening to you as good things, or you don't have to see it as good, but you can see it as the potential to make something good, turn lemons into lemonade, as the old saying would say. That potential exists, and as soon as you start to see that potential, the potential for positive from the negative, you will start to see less and less negative things in your life and more positive things. But as a part of that, as no longer seeing yourself as the victim, gives you the opportunity to take your life into your own hands and do what you want, and understand that, it's up to you. And a lot of the limitations you see in your life are revolving around money, and you're saying, I can't do that because I don't have enough money. And this year is going to be the sea change, the flipping of the switch is starting to happen, where people are going to start and understand that money is a consequence. It is a symptom of your mindset. It is not the issue that you are dealing with. Your life, you're not struggling because of a lack of money. You have a lack of money because you're struggling with your relationship with yourself. And that's some woo-woo meta stuff. And the basic kind of like the most popular package for that information is called The Secret. But I honestly do believe that. There are lots of really interesting tricks to tricking you into being successful and having money, and none of them are, it does come down to this idea of like, what comes first, the action or the thought? If all the things you're doing are bringing into reality something that you thought of first. So the question is, what is the relationship to that thought? Like, I want an apple. And then you go to the store and you get an apple, and that seems very real, but you have to understand that the thought came first and then the apple came, and that's the basis of the universe. And you can test that theory of like, okay, I want this. How long is it going to take to get it? And when you start to let go of this idea that you have to be this person that's doing something rather than a being that things can happen to you, you can think, I want an apple, and someone will set an apple down in front of you. And like, that's a very normal consequence of a deep spiritual practice and investigation into the self, is the increasing syncing up of your experience with your desires and like how the world you relate to the world. Like, it becomes, as soon as you are opening yourself up to this potential of kind of like magic and lack of coincidence, more and more things begin to happen to you that are seemingly lacking in coincidence and magical. So I would highly recommend that you take a minute to see the world around yourself and start looking for the potential of magic. And just, if nothing else, take more time in the day to imagine what it must be like to be like a child, like in a city, and like you look up and the buildings are so big, and to see everything as big and wonderful. Like, that's the best place to start, is to just remember what it's like to be in complete awe of everything around you. And that's a practice that you need. It's not something that happens to you. That is something that you cultivate in yourself. It is an ability that you have of like taking a minute to think, what's going on around me that's amazing? What should I be really appreciative right now that I'm probably not appreciative of? How can I see the world around me as magical where I didn't see it magical 5 seconds ago? Because the second you begin to see the world as magic, you find yourself in a much better mood, for one thing, because being in magical places is the funnest thing ever. It's what Disney World is trying to do, like to inspire an unending, infinite awe in the child of like, wow, and the child with suspension of disbelief is so much better prepared to go to Disneyland and see it as magical, because they can separate that whole kind of like the realty and the not real parts of it. And they didn't have to pay, the $85 for the ticket. So that really helps them out a lot too. But you as a parent should be looking at your child and seeing their wonder, and you should be letting them teach you how to think the world is wonderful again, and how to have that sparkle in your eyes, because that is the first major step to improving your life, is seeing the world as good rather than seeing the world as bad, because the world is what you see it. And so that's kind of like the last prediction there, is that we are going to see the shifting, and that's really with a prime mover, in my opinion. The critical mass of people are going to be taking a quiet moment to themselves, to think, to work on themselves, to go, just take a quiet moment and think, what am I doing? How could I be doing this better? Who else is, doing this, and why are they doing that? And like, instead of being kind of trapped in the flow, take a step back and look at the flow and decide if it's the flow you want to be in, take a minute and think about it. think about what the world is like. Think about who you are. What does that mean? Have really deep, scary thoughts. The universe is freaking gigantic, unfathomably gigantic. And some people are afraid of just imagining and thinking on that level. It's hard to imagine something that is unimaginable. It's right there in the words. But anyway, so I think that this year is basically the year when enough people where the swing is going to happen, where everyone's going to be like, it really is time to get back to nature. Everyone needs a garden, and let's focus on making ourselves better, and maybe let's not focus so much on this big picture stuff that we're getting from the boob tube, from the light box in the living room, that's telling us that the things that we need to be worried about will suddenly seem inconsequential, because they've seemed inconsequential to me for well over a decade. So I'm really excited that people are interacting with the world in the way they are, because now I feel like I have way more friends, because people are thinking, I don't like what I'm seeing, and I think it needs to change. And I've thought that for a very long time. So I welcome all of you newcomers to the idea that we could do better. We could do a lot better. And I've had a lot of, I get into this argument with people, and they're like, oh, I'm so tired of this thing that it's not good. And it isn't that it isn't good. We have it great. The United States has it really good. But I promise you, it pales in comparison to what we potentially could have. And I think that we are going to see this year a couple of pinholes in this kind of dark room that we're in, pinholes. And they're going to be there's light streaming in from these little pinholes. And people are going to be like, wait, where's this light coming from? Is there something outside of this bubble that we've been in? And I think more and more people, a critical number of people, are going to realize that maybe we should be cutting a hole in the room and seeking the light that is outside of it. Because while it's not bad in a certain perspective, it pales in comparison to what we potentially could have. And I think that now is the time. Let's move into the future. So do take a moment to close your eyes and imagine a better future. And if you, in that moment, can imagine a way that you can help that future coming into being, then I suggest that you embrace that notion and you do it, because that notion was probably meant to be there in that moment for you. So I have no idea what time it is. I was planning on going a little bit short today because I'm all by myself. So I'll just finish up with some of the goals for myself so I can look back next year and see, did I do it or did I not do it? And my life has turned more towards art than it ever has before, which I think is a fantastic change. I am a fabricator. I make stuff, and I would recommend you go see some of that stuff get made, and a little bit's on Instagram and stuff. But honestly, I'm so busy making, I'm terrible at publicizing myself. But let's set that as a goal. Let's do a better job of putting my work out there for all to see and documenting. Let's do more of the creative and less of the linear in the box type of things. And I would like to establish a practice this year, a really concrete movement and mental practice. And I'm really enjoying the podcasting thing, and I want to do that more, and I want to get a little bit more into the esoteric. I really enjoy words, and I want to explore concepts and odd phrases. Like today, the thing that's been echoing in my head is that Del, the funky Homo sapien, has this line that upgrade your gray matter, because one day it may matter. That's off the original Deltron album. And I really like that, and I will change it to upgrade your gray matter, because it already does matter. And with that, we'll call it the end of the podcast. My name's Samson. This is the WeAreDenver podcast network. I have not been joined by anyone today, and they helped me explain nothing, so I find that quite appropriate. I hope you're having a wonderful day. Don't forget, tomorrow's the eclipse. Let's call in the future, because we're already a few years behind on that. Big up to Rich in the Ghost House studio, who provides this wonderful space for us and what we do. Big up to Miles, who is running the video switcher in there, and who is an awesome human being. On that, I will say, I look around me and I see wonder every day, and this year I'm going to look around me and I'm going to see more than ever. So, cheers. We'll catch you on the next one. Thanks for tuning in, guys. I really appreciate it.
You're prepared for the 31st century with advanced programming in quad rendering and Java++ scripting language.